네, 다음으로 두 번째 기조연사를 소개해 드리겠습니다. 첫 번째 기조 강연에 대한 질문은 아까 말씀드렸던 slido.com 접속하셔서 질문 올려주시면 첫 번째 정책 대담 시간에 질문들 받아볼 수 있지 않을까 싶습니다. 두 번째 기조 강연 연사분을 소개하겠습니다. 리처드 윌킨슨 영국 노팅엄대학교 사회역학 명예교수님께서 불평등한 사회는 어떻게 퇴보하는가 라는 주제의 기조 강연 해 주시겠습니다. 리처드 윌킨슨 교수님을 큰 박수로 무대로 모십니다. 네, 윌킨슨 교수님은 불평등과 건강의 상관관계라는 독특한 주제를 오랫동안 주목해 오신 학자입니다. 오늘 멋진 기조 강연 준비해 주셨는데요. 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드립니다.
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I must say I thought that was a masterful presentation that Thomas Piketty gave. I was very glad to hear it. I want to describe the work that Kate Pickett and I have done. We've shared in this work equally. We are interchangeable as speakers. She is sitting there in front, and you'll hear from her later. I want really to talk about the effects of large income differences within a society. I'm going to briefly sketch the material in our spirit level book that came out in Britain 9 years ago, and more recently in other countries, and then cover some of the material in our new book called The Inner Level, which came out earlier this year. I think that we profoundly misunderstand inequality. I'm going to talk about the damaging social effects and the damaging psychological effects, which I think many people imagine that Kate and I produced this story for the first time. But actually, evidence that inequality is damaging to health, raising death rates, and increasing levels of violence as measured by homicide rates, first came out in the 1970s. There are now literally hundreds of papers in the academic journals showing the effects that I'm going to outline now. I'm going to show you just very simple correlations between inequality and these damaging outcomes. We don't control for things because other people in the academic journals have produced complicated statistical models controlling for poverty, for education, for other levels of income, all sorts of outcomes. They've looked at changes over time between inequality and these outcomes. Our aim was really to show the public this story that had been developing in the academic journals, to get it out of the journals, the academic journals that nobody reads, into the public arena, because it's really important to understand how inequality damages the social fabric of our society. Right. Yes. So I think there's a naive view of inequality, that it only matters if it creates absolute poverty. Then it would be wrong for other people to live in great luxury. But that's not understanding much the most important part of it in our rich societies. Inequality is now a social relationship. It increases those elements of superiority, those feelings of superiority and inferiority, dominance and subordination. We really need to understand inequality as creating a structure of social relationships between us. And that's close to the heart of the damage it does. In a way that I have very little to tell you. This graph says it all, that with more income inequality, bigger income differences between rich and poor, you have more of a whole range of social problems. I'm going to show you the data and then go on to explaining the social and psychological processes that lie behind it. The data we used when we were writing our spirit level book was simply the data on income differences downloaded from the UN Human Development Report, most of which they got, I think, from the World Bank and the Luxembourg Income Study. We never choose the data, we just download it from WHO or OECD or whatever. We make no judgments of whether WHO's figures on death rates are accurate or whether the World Bank's figures on income distribution. We just use what they have. If they have data on one of the countries we're looking at, it goes into the analysis. And you see, in the rich developed market democracies, the gap between the top 20% and the bottom 20% is sort of 3.5 or 4 times, the top 20% are getting 3.5 or 4 times as much as the bottom 20% in the more equal countries, the Scandinavian countries and Japan. I know that inequality has increased in Japan and many other countries, but those were the figures when we put this data together. And in countries like Australia, UK, Portugal, USA, Singapore on the right, the gap was twice as big. We used that measure simply because it's easy for people to understand. The results would have looked very similar if we'd used the Gini coefficient. And what we did is simply look at outcomes in different countries on a whole range of problems that you can get from respected international sources. So life expectancy from the World Health Organization, maths and literacy scores from OECD of young people, infant mortality rates, homicide rates, the proportion of the population in prison, teenage birth rates, levels of trust, how much people feel they can trust each other in society, obesity rates, mental illness, which in the standard psychiatric classification of mental illnesses includes drug and alcohol addiction, and some figures on social mobility. There you see them all in the same index, weighted equally. So where a country is its sort of average performance. And what you're seeing is that the more unequal countries on the right, USA, Portugal, UK, are doing worse on all those outcomes than the more equal countries on the left. And it's really an astonishing close relationship. We were worried that people would think that we were just choosing outcomes that suited our argument. So we also looked at the Unicef Index of Child Wellbeing. We did a paper in the British Medical Journal on its different components. It has about 40 different components designed to measure child well-being in rich, developed countries. So whether children feel they can talk to their parents, what immunization rates are like amongst children, what their maths and reading scores are like. All that goes into the UNICEF Index of Child Wellbeing. And here you see it in relation to that, to inequality, with the more unequal countries with lower levels of child well-being across that wide range of measures. We looked at an earlier measure produced by UNICEF and at changes over time between them, and of course the countries that have had the biggest rises in inequalities have the worst performance in terms of changes in child well-being. The relationship is quite striking. I want to show you some of the individual outcomes before I move into what's going on behind these figures, so you can see the scale of the differences in performance between more and less equal societies. This is mental illness. It's the proportion of the population who had any mental illness in the previous year. Usually it's anxiety disorders and depression, they're not asked whether they've been diagnosed with depression, because that would be too affected by whether mental illnesses are recognized in a society, how easily you access the medical system. This is based instead on random samples of the population which are given diagnostic interviews. It's work carried out by WHO to allow us to make comparisons between countries of levels of mental illness. And you see that some countries have 3 times as much mental illness on those measures as others. The proportion of the population in prison. It's a log scale up the side, and there you see at least 10-fold differences in the proportion of the population locked up in different countries. Indeed, some of the American states, when we were writing, spent more on imprisonment than they did on higher education. And really appalling, pushed into appalling policies. That relationship is not primarily driven by more crime. It's driven primarily by more punitive sentencing. You get sent to prison more easily for smaller offenses. You stay in prison for longer in more unequal societies. I don't know whether it's less trust up and down the social hierarchy, or more fear, more punitive attitudes, but I think it's that area you have to be thinking about to understand why so many more people are imprisoned in more unequal societies. This is the only graph where the inequality data is the other way round. This comes from people in Statistics Canada, published in the British Medical Journal, and it shows death rates for men of working age in American states and Canadian provinces. The Canadian provinces in red at the bottom right, at the more equal end in this graph. That is the age range over which these relationships are closest. They're still highly statistically significant amongst women and amongst children, less so amongst old people. This is a graph of social mobility. It's important because I think many people believe that if you can find your appropriate level in society, the idea that if you work hard, you'll move up, and if you don't work hard or you fail, you'll move down. People suggest that means that big income differences are fair if they are the result of different amounts of work and application and ability. But actually what this is showing is that in more unequal societies on the right, there is less social mobility. That's now been shown on about 3 different data sets. The measure of social mobility is intergenerational income mobility. So it's really asking, do rich fathers have rich sons and poor fathers poor sons? Or doesn't fathers' income matter very much? And what you're seeing here is that in more unequal societies with those bigger income gaps, fathers' income matters more. In a sense, and what it's showing is that parents pass on to their children their advantages and disadvantages. If you want to improve equal opportunities for children, you want to move nearer equal opportunities for children, probably the most important thing you can do is to reduce the income differences between their parents and in the society more widely. I want now to give you first a flavor, an idea of what inequality does to social relationships in the society in general. This is a graph of social cohesion, involvement in community life. There are many studies showing these measures of community life weaken in more unequal societies. And you see quite big differences there between the more unequal societies on the right and the more equal ones on the left. There are also studies which show that people trust each other less in more unequal societies. I should say that we did all this work. We showed not only amongst these countries internationally, but we showed the same relationships amongst the 50 states of the United States. The more unequal states do worse on all the same measures. And again, you see quite big differences. On the right, 15 or 20% of the population feel they can trust others. And among the more equal countries, 60 or 65% of the population feel they can trust others. If you've got to walk home alone in a big city, you'll feel much safer doing that in a more equal society. It really makes a difference to the quality of life, perhaps even more for women than men. There are also research papers showing that people are more willing to help each other in more equal societies. They're more willing to help the old people and disabled people. So what you're seeing is the atrophying, the weakening of community life, the weakening of the bonds between us, but also rises in violence. These are homicide rates amongst American states in red, and in blue the Canadian provinces. And there are tenfold differences in homicide rates there related closely to inequality. That's a very well-researched relationship. Papers from all over the world showing that violence tends reliably to be more common in more unequal societies. And again, it tells us about what's happening to the social fabric. And if you go to much more unequal societies than the ones in our data, more unequal than Britain and the US, look at places like Mexico, where we've been invited to give lectures. You find there that people are afraid of each other, that they're barricading their houses. There are bars on the windows and on the doors, and razor wire around the top of the fence. And if you look at South Africa, which has very high inequality for quite different reasons, you see exactly the same thing. People in those very unequal societies, it's not just that community life has weakened and people don't trust each other, it's that they've become afraid of each other. That's the effect on the social fabric. And what I find really extraordinary is that this picture I've given you in those last few slides about the damage inequality does to social relationships is shown in quite different data. This is data from 2 American economists looking at the proportion of the labor force in each country involved in what they call guard labor. People employed in as security staff or police or prison officers. That goes up with inequality. They've shown it for these countries internationally. They've also shown it amongst the 50 American states, as we did with all these different outcomes. And what this guard labor, these security staff and so on are doing is protecting us from each other. We haven't yet looked at the proportion of the population who are lawyers. But of course, as we trust each other less, we need lawyers more. So I'm sure we'd find the same relationships there. I think what I've just described is probably one of the most important processes underlying the relationships I showed you earlier. It's not something that's quite different from class and status. In a way, I think what we're looking at is whether we live in societies with very steep social hierarchies like that, or much shallower ones like that. You all know that in the poorest areas of the cities, children do worst at school. You all know that health is worst in those poorest areas. The outcomes that get worse with more inequality are outcomes that have social gradients. When I say social gradients, I mean they become more common at the bottom of the social ladder. So although there's ill health and drug abuse and crime and so on at the top of the social hierarchy, they're all more common at the bottom. It is those kinds of problems that get worse with more inequality. And they don't just get worse amongst the poor. Inequality affects us all. The biggest effects of inequality are amongst the poor. But even if we take well-educated people with good incomes, good jobs, if they were in a more equal society, they'd probably live a little bit longer, their children might do a little bit better at school, they'd be less likely to become victims of violence. In that sense, even better off people do better if they live in more equal societies. So remember, this isn't something separate from class and status. It's telling you more about that relationship that you've always recognized. I want, at this point, to tell you, I think people have always thought about inequality in terms of a relationship between us and our material possessions, our material circumstances. I think actually that it's what I've been describing is about a sensitivity to social status, social position, an inherited part of our psychology. I think to understand it, you need to understand monkeys, perhaps more than you need to understand Marx. You need to understand the dominance hierarchy and our sensitivity to that. I want to read you a quote from a study which looked at the experience of poverty in very different societies. It looked at the experience of poverty in Uganda, in India, in China, Pakistan, in Korea here, in the United Kingdom, and Norway. And of course, in some of those countries, poverty means living as in the picture on the right. In Norway, it means living in flats like those on the left. 3-bedroom flats with central heating, people, even the poor, the bottom 20%, owning most of the consumer durables and electronics. So poverty in material terms means totally different things in those different societies. But when in a study they interviewed people in poverty in these different countries, this is what they said. Respondents universally despised poverty and frequently despised themselves for being poor. Parents were often despised by their children, women despised their menfolk, and some men were reported to take out their self-loathing on their partners and children. Despite generally believing that they had done their best against all odds, they mostly considered that they had both failed themselves by being poor and that others saw them as failures. This internalization of shame was further externally reinforced in the family, the workplace, and in their dealings with officialdom. Even children couldn't escape this shaming, for with the possible exception of Pakistan, school was an engine of social grading, a place of humiliation for those without the possessions that guaranteed social acceptance. The paper goes on talking in those terms at length. And so the experience in poverty, despite the differences in material conditions, it's an experience of being looked down on, regarded as inferior at the bottom of the social ladder. And there are very good reasons, evolutionary reasons, why we should be sensitive to that. I want now to describe our more recent work on the psychological effects of inequality, which goes on to, I think, show the kind of things that are behind the relationships that I've been talking about. If you live in a very unequal society, the people at the top are regarded as supremely important. They regard themselves almost as a different race. They think of themselves as much more able. They probably believe they're genetically much more able than the rest of the population. And the people at the bottom are not only regarded as almost worthless, many of them believe that their social position shows their inability, their failure, and so on. And so, where status becomes more important, we all get more sensitive to how we're seen and judged. We judge each other more by status, and we worry more about how we are judged. This is a study done by Richard Late and Christopher Whelan in Ireland, and it looks in all the different income groups, from the poorest on the left, the lowest tenth of the population, to the richest tenth on the right. And what it's showing is that in the most unequal countries, there is more status anxiety, more worry about how you're seen and judged, what people think of you. And in the more equal countries, lower levels of status anxiety. And again, notice it's not just the poor who are feeling the effects of inequality. Everyone is affected. We also know from many psychological studies that the kinds of stresses that most reliably push up our stress hormones affecting the immune system, the cardiovascular system, many other processes, are just these worries about how we're seen and judged. A meta-analysis of, I think, 208 psychological studies said that the tasks which most reliably push up levels of our stress hormones, cortisol that you can measure in saliva or in the blood, the tasks which do that most strongly are tasks that include social evaluative threat, threats to social status and self-esteem, where others can negatively judge your performance. And of course, that's why we all regard things like public speaking as stressful. It's those kind of stresses that get to us. We also know from recent work that this feeds directly into a range of mental illnesses which are connected to issues to do with dominance and subordination. A paper by Sherry Johnson, a psychologist at Berkeley in the United States, went through enormous literature on mental illnesses and found evidence of a number of different kinds: biological evidence, self-reported evidence, behavioral evidence, that a range of mental illnesses processed by what is called the dominance behavioral system, part of our brains that are involved in assessing social status, and which in monkeys tells a subordinate monkey it must behave differently to a dominant from a subordinate. We still have that area of our brain. And what Sherry Johnson and her colleagues showed is that there are different responses to those worries about how you're seen and judged. You can either accept your inferiority, you can believe that you're inferior and incapable. You can start finding social life too stressful, difficult to meet other people. Social contact becomes an ordeal. You're worried about social comparisons. You withdraw from social life, feeling that it's all too stressful. And so you get rises in social anxiety. And lots of comments on the web, people sharing their experience of social anxiety, who are responding to that threat, that social evaluative threat that is higher in more unequal societies. I'm going to read just one account from a woman talking about how she experiences it. She says, "I'm extremely shy around both people I know and don't know. It hinders my everyday life so much that people think I'm making it up. I have no friends. It's hard for me to go anywhere. I always make sure I go shopping in the day. That way I can wear sunglasses or a hat. It's my security blanket against social anxiety disorder. I get tongue-tied and sweaty when I feel they're looking at me, like I'm some sort of freak. It's a living hell I struggle with on a daily basis. So those worries about social comparisons, which often can lead into things like suicide, made worse in more unequal societies. And there are about 3 different data sets that show that inequality is more common, that depression is more common in more unequal societies. But there's another response. If you're worried about what people think of you, another response is to talk yourself up, to try and communicate your importance, your position, probably to exaggerate it. You become narcissistic. Instead of being modest about your achievements and abilities, you flaunt them. And what we see, again, is that people do more of that. So not only do they go under, withdrawing from social life, feeling a failure, feeling inferior, but others do the opposite. This is called self-enhancement. People in this study in these different countries were asked by an international team of psychologists, how do you think you compare with other people in your society? Do you think you're more intelligent than most people in Korea? Do you think you're more attractive? Do you think you're more generous? How do you think you compare with others? It's a bit like you've probably heard the joke that 90% of Americans think they're better drivers than average. In Sweden, I think it's only 55 or 60% who imagine they're better drivers than average. But still, 90%, that's people having an inflated idea of themselves. And that's what you're seeing here, quite a strong relationship with inequality. So that's showing this other response as well. There's also evidence that psychotic disorders, schizophrenia, a range of mental illnesses also connected to the dominance behavioral system are more common in more unequal societies. So we should think of inequality as having profound psychological effects, really getting into our ideas of what success and failure is about. The most obvious way in which we try and improve our image in other people's eyes, the most obvious way in which we try and big ourselves up and show our importance, is through consumerism. Buying the goods that make us look successful. And there are now studies which show if you live in a more unequal area, you're more likely to spend money on status goods, on a flashy car, and things like that. And how important that is as a driver of consumerism, I think is shown by this graph. It's American data, and it shows as inequality went up between the 1990s and the early 2000s, debt followed that. People are borrowing money to keep up with other people. And I think it's really important that when we think about consumerism and the environment, we recognize that if we're going to deal with what is perhaps one of the biggest obstacles to moving towards environmental sustainability, we have to reduce the intensity of that consumerism. And that means reducing inequality. You can see, and one of the big surprises, Kate and I came at this work through trying to understand, as epidemiologists, the large social class differences in death rates between rich and poor, higher social classes and lower social classes. In Britain, depending on whether you're looking at the very small areas, rich and poor, very small areas, you may find 15 or 20-year differences in life expectancy between those. If you take different social classes, 5 or 10-year differences in life expectancy. It's appalling human rights abuse. But one of the big surprises as we worked on this with colleagues around the world was how important social status is itself. Low social status is not just a proxy for other determinants of health. Also, how important friendship is. A meta-analysis of 150 studies of friendship and health shows that whether you have friends is at least as important as whether or not you smoke to survival in over a follow-up period. Your involvement with other people is powerfully protective of health. Also, the studies of happiness show just the same thing. Happiness is crucially determined by the quality of our social relationships, whether we have friends, whether we're involved in community life. So increasingly, if we're really going to improve the quality of life and well-being in rich, developed societies, we must start thinking about the quality of social relations and recognizing how important it is to reduce inequality, to reduce its divisive effects that I showed you earlier. And I think actually it's not just dominance patterns that are part of our evolved psychology. In our prehistory, as hunters and gatherers, through over 90% of our existence as anatomically modern human beings, we lived in extraordinary egalitarian societies. Hunting and gathering societies were remarkably egalitarian. There are a few exceptions, but that is a pattern you see on one continent after another. Within those societies, of course, the more cooperative people were selected as partners, the more selfish became ostracized. There were powerful pressures that ensured this became part of our evolved psychology too. So we've got those social strategies to do with dominance. We can play those games, we can use those strategies, but we've also got the strategies to do with equality, friendship, social interaction, social cohesion, reciprocity. We know how to do both those sets of social relations. And it's really built into our language that words like companion in European languages combines the word con and pan. Your companions are people with whom you share the basic necessities of life. And of course, in the religious symbolism of the communion in Christian sects, you find the sharing of bread and wine as a symbolism of the necessity of sharing basic relationships, basic necessities. We eat together, again, because of the social importance of sharing basic necessities. And when I was talking about the opposition, if you like, between the damaging effects of bigger status differences and low social status and the very protective effects of friendship, what you're seeing there are the two different ways we can come together as human beings. Either we fight for everything that we all need, sexual partners, food, jobs, whatever, or animals with nesting sites or territories, or we recognize each other's need and share. And this American anthropologist who worked all his life on hunting and gathering societies, he says, gifts make friends and friends make gifts. You know, the gift is the symbol that I recognize your need. I'm not going to fight you for access to whatever it is. And your sense of indebtedness, which maybe makes you reciprocate, he suggests is a basic social compact between people. And some psychologists suggest that that sense of indebtedness, which makes you reciprocate, is a basic part of human nature. I believe this data on income inequality in Korea is very controversial, and most people believe that the real figures are much higher than that, so I won't linger on that. But I do think it's worth pointing out that in this report from the Development Finance International and Oxfam, although Korea came 56 out of 157 countries in evaluations of policy to reduce inequalities, tax policy, labor policy, and public expenditure. Korea came about a third of the way down the list. In terms of improvement over the last year, Korea has the biggest improvement of any of those countries. You know, it's really heartening to see those signs of progress under President Moon. In the rich developed countries, there have been these long-term changes in inequality, from high inequality in the 1920s in most countries, reducing inequalities from about sometime in the 1930s, and then the modern rise of inequality. And I think that one has to understand a powerful component of that is the rise and fall of the whole social democratic, the labor movement, the fear of communism, and indeed you can see relationships in one country after another between what's happening to inequality during the 20th century and what happens to the proportion of the population in trade unions. I've seen those graphs for half a dozen different countries, and I do think that the membership of trade unions reflects the sort of waxing and waning of the sort of countervailing voice in society, the idea that there's another way of doing things, but I think also the fear of communism, which in some ways was beneficial to capitalism. It looks to us as if it doesn't matter which way you get your greater equality, by redistribution after tax, through taxes and incomes, or whether it's by reducing income differences before taxes. Some countries and some American states do one, and some do the other. And we find that it confers the same social benefits both ways. We think that now the most important thing to do, really to embed greater equality more deeply in our societies, is to move towards all forms of economic democracy, by which I mean not only token employee representatives on company boards, but really strong representation, ideally increasing over time, but also more incentives to more thoroughly democratic enterprises like cooperatives and employee-owned companies. And the evaluations of more democratic structures do seem to suggest not only are they nicer places to work, but they have higher productivity. Combine ownership with participative management and you get reliable increases in productivity. Lots of studies showing that. So I think that's where I'll end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Wilkinson, for the riveting talk on disturbingly wide-reaching effects of inequality. 네, 기조 강연 해주신 리처드 윌킨슨 교수님께 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드립니다.